my crafty friends, and welcome to the Crochet Cakes YouTube channel. I'm so glad you could join me for another video. This is the introduction for the Crochet Yoga tank top. In it, we will cover all the little notes that you need to hopefully be able to crochet your own tank top. Whether or not you use it for yoga is irrelevant, but I want you to have all the details that you need to make this top your own. So let's cover construction, let's cover notes, sizes, materials, and of course measurements. So let's discuss the Crochet Yoga tank top. Now, as you can tell from the video, this is a crop top. Its construction, it is a bottom-up construction made in two panels. So this means that we have a front panel and a back panel that will be seamed at the sides, and later we'll have some straps that will connect the front panel to the back panel. Once we've done all our connections, then we're going to pick out some stitches around the armhole to just seal it all nicely together and to, of course, have a little bit of finishing around the armholes. Now, the finished measurements of this top that you see me wearing here are 13 inches on the front panel, measured from the collarbone to the waist. Then the final width is 30 inches around. So that would be 1 inch of positive ease around the waist and 3 inches of negative ease around the bust. The back panel measures 14 inches from the top of the panel to the bottom, and the armhole, before we add the straps, it was about 6.5 inches. Now keep in mind, these measurements are all given after blocking, okay? And this is very, very important. After blocking, it means that I soaked this piece and then brought it out of its bath, lightly rolled it in a towel to soak up all the excess water, and then used blocking mats to lay it flat, gently stretch it to make sure that my rows were even, and pinned it in place. That's what blocking means. So we've discussed a little bit about the construction of this top. Now let's discuss who can make this top. Well, you know, anyone that really wants to can make it, but for the skills required, I consider this an adventurous beginner or an intermediate crochet pattern. And let me explain. We're going to be using some skills that if you're a very, very beginner crocheter, perhaps you're not familiar with. So we're going to be using foundation stitches. That means specifically foundation single crochet stitches. We're not going to be using a chain because we want our work to stretch very nicely. We're also going to be seaming a garment, which, you know, it's not necessarily something a very, very beginner is experienced with. Although, let me just say, the skill of seaming is kind of transferable. So if you've seamed granny squares together, you can seam a garment. We're also going to be working with half double crochet stitches. We're going to be working with chains, and we're going to be working with slip stitches and half double crochet decreases. Okay, so this is why I say it's comfortably an intermediate pattern, although there is no skill that we use in this tutorial that you won't be able to find a tutorial for. Incidentally, in the description box below, you will find my tutorials for a invisible decreasing as well as foundationless starting methods. The other thing to consider is that the Crochet Yoga tank top is a made to measure pattern. Now I want to give you a little caveat here. When I first started crocheting, I freehanded this garment, but I was keeping certain things in mind. So for example, I chose to use a fingering weight wool yarn. So this is 75-25 superwash merino nylon, and I had 100 grams, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So I chose to work with a fingering weight wool yarn. And I knew that once wet and blocked and dried, the wool would stretch. So I decided that my starting foundation single crochet would be 1 inch less than I needed it to be. So if I needed my waist to be 29 inches, 30 inches around, then I went with a foundation chain or foundation single crochet that was 29 inches around. Well, when doubled, because as I said, we are working in a front and back panel, so that means that I did a foundation single crochet that went lightly and gently stretched, reached 14.5 inches. Now let me explain by what I mean lightly and gently. So once you've done your foundation single crochet and you think you're going to measure it, right? So what you're going to do is you're going to lay that piece flat you're going to take your measuring tape and you're going to align it with the left or right side, whatever, one corner of your project. You're going to press that gently down, and then you're going to take your other hand and you're going to gently, very gently pass your hand through it as if you were flattening the piece. And you're going to see from that gentleness how much it's stretched. In my case, you can see in the video that my piece stretches to 14.5 inches, and that is exactly what I was looking for. So I stopped crocheting there. Now, of course, because I've already gone through this painful process, you don't have to freehand it if you don't want to. You can use math to work it all out, because the next thing we're going to discuss is gauge. Now, the gauge for this project, I can give you my unblocked gauge as well as my blocked gauge. Of course, keep in mind that for the blocked gauge, this is what your final garment is going to be looking like, potentially the first 5 times you wash it. After that, I don't make any guarantees. Excuse me, I thought I had written down my unblocked gauge, but what I wrote down were my unblocked measurements. So my unblocked measurements width-wise, it was 14.25 inches, as I've said. And the height of the body, so that is before we split for the armholes and door armhole shaping, was 8.25 inches, and the armhole depth was 6 inches. So after my piece was blocked, my width of the garment was 15 inches for each panel. The height of the body was 9 inches, and then my armhole was 6.5 inches. Now keep in mind, this was before adding the straps. Those were the unblocked and the blocked measurements. Now, I said we're going to be discussing gauge. So gauge. I have 18 stitches and 14 rows in 4 inches. So if you're familiar with gauge and you've mathed it all out before, you know that when you have this gauge given in 4 inches, you then divide each of these numbers by 4 to get your 1-inch gauge. And that 1-inch gauge is what you're going to use to multiply your width. So, I don't know. Let's do a quick math. Let's give you something different. Let's say your gauge is 19 stitches. We're going to divide 19 by 4. That gives us 4.75 stitches per inch. So 4.75 times, let's say you want a 32-inch waist. So times 32 gives you 152 stitches. Now you're going to need to divide this number by 2, because remember, we're working front and back panels. So we're going to divide that number by 2, and that is 76 stitches. Now if you're working this crochet yoga tank top that I'm sharing with you here, you need odd multiples. So you can either go up to 77 stitches or down to 75 stitches to work out your width for each panel. So if, let's say you go up to 77 stitches, okay? So 77 stitches, and we're going to divide that by our 1-inch gauge. So 77 divided by 4.75 is 16.20. So that means that you multiply 16.2 times 2, your garment is going to be 32.5 inches wide. Okay? That's how that works. It took me forever to wrap my head around that when I wanted to design stuff, so don't be scared, don't be upset if it takes you a while to. Of course, you could go with the freehand method. There's nothing wrong with that either. Just make sure that you work possibly 1 inch less than you want your actual finished length to be. And of course, doing a gauge swatch with half double crochet stitches and a 4mm crochet hook, which is what I used, will be very, very helpful. Especially because gauge swatches not only let you know how many stitches per inch you have, but they also let you know how your material is going to behave. So now that I've mentioned my gauge and I've mentioned the final measurements of this top, what are my body measurements? So my bust is 33 inches and my waist is 29 inches. That means that the final garment measurement gives me 1 inch of positive ease around my waist, because remember, positive ease is when the garment is wider than our measurement, and it gives me 3 inches of negative ease around the bust. And remember that that negative ease means that your garment has to stretch to fit. Nothing wrong with that, especially because I did want this top to be for yoga, so I didn't want it to be moving around a lot while I was doing yoga poses, especially downward dog. I hate having my face covered when I'm in downward dog. So we've covered construction, we've covered measurements, my body measurements, as well as the finished item measurements, and we've covered gauge and given you a little bit of an idea of what to do if you want to freehand your garment and not exactly follow my gauge, which I understand, because that way you can just use any material that you have on hand. Now, speaking of materials, I used a wool yarn. So specifically, I used Little Bean Loves hand-painted yarns. I don't think she's a dyer anymore, unfortunately, and this colorway was called Dragonfire. It was a gradient yarn. Now, because it was a gradient yarn, she very kindly had it separated into two 50-gram cakes, which means that my pieces are identical because I am not working from the 100-gram hank. So both of the tops started with the same, both of the cakes started with the same color. Important to note. The other thing is that Little Bean Loves, this yarn was a fingering weight yarn, 75-25 superwash merino nylon blend. But it did have 463 yards in 100 grams. So it was a particularly thin fingering weight, in contrast to the yarn that I'm currently using to crochet up another one of these tank tops, which is from Stitchcraft and Wizardry. I forgot what base it is specifically, but it is also a wool base. I'm pretty sure it is 80% merino wool, Australian merino wool, and then 20% nylon. It's very soft and very plump, so it actually has a bit less yardage than the Little Bean Loves yarn, which means that because it is plumper, my gauge, I had to adjust. So I actually cast on 65 stitches on that one instead of the 67 that I'm going to be recommending in this pattern. So for materials, I did say that if you go the freehand method, you can choose what material you're going to be working with. I just really want you to keep in mind that I chose a wool blend, so that's stretched. If you're going to choose a 100% cotton, that may not stretch as much as the wool blend did. And most importantly, if you go the other end of the spectrum and you decide to work with a bamboo yarn or cotton bamboo blend or even a linen or linen blend, keep in mind that linen grows and grows and grows the more you wash it. So you may want to go with even more of a negative ease when you're working up with linen yarn. The best advice that I can give when you're going to want to work with linen yarn is to actually wash, block, and dry your piece 3 times. And on that third one, use that third stitch count and row count to count as your gauge. And if you want, you can keep track of its growth by taking your gauge every time the piece dries and keeping it in a little notebook. Trust me, you will find that very helpful. All right, so what other materials do we need to crochet up the Crochet Yoga tank top? So I already mentioned that we need 100 grams of fingering weight wool, 463 yards in 100 grams. Now, having said that, I used 95 grams, but I did make it rather cropped, as you saw. So for any changes or any sizes that you want to go up or down, well, up actually, I would recommend that you have an extra 50 grams of yarn just laying around, which is perfect. Like if you want to use scraps or anything, I think it would look really, really cool. So just keep in mind that for every size up you go, you should have 50 grams of yarn to account for that. And especially if you are going to be adding length to your crop top, you should also have more yarn to account for that. Because as we know, any changes in gauge materials, hooks, can affect how much yarn is needed. And hooks, speaking of hooks, I am using a 4mm Furls Odyssey crochet hook. And I always mention, or try to remember to mention, what hook I'm using for patterns, because as I just mentioned, your hook can affect your gauge. Now, in terms of these Furl Odyssey crochet hooks, they are great for when you have tendonitis or you just need the extra weighted handle to kind of provide a counterbalance when you're crocheting. But I do tend to have a looser tension with them, which again, I'm okay because I can safely crochet with these Furl's Odyssey crochet hooks. Now, unfortunately, I can't link them for you because, well, I can link them for you if you want to read more about them, but they are having supplier problems, so they don't have any Furl's Odyssey crochet hooks in stock. Other materials that we're going to need is, of course, a tape measure because you need to take your own measurements. And as I said, the measurements we're going to be basing our top on our waist measurements and our bust measurements. So for the waist, you're going to take your hands and you're going to place them on your waist. Wherever they naturally fall, that is where you're going to measure. I recommend being in front of a mirror for this, or if possible, having someone else take your measurements so that you don't affect your measurements by bending or moving at weird angles. For your bust, I actually recommend that if possible, you lay parallel to the floor to have a best bra fit kind of thing. Other than tape measure, we're going to need some stitch markers, we're going to need a yarn needle, we're going to need some scissors, and we're going to need a calculator or our phones, of course, and we're also going to need blocking pins and mats. Now, blocking pins and mats are just highly recommended, but if they're not available to you, it's okay. Just make sure to lay your piece flat on a towel to dry, and make sure that when you're laying it flat, it's, you know, it's not weirdly positioned or anything, and that your rows line up so that your piece can look as pretty as possible, and then, you know, make it easier to seam later on. So once again, guys, thank you so much for joining me, just blathering on this intro about the Crochet Yoga tank top for you guys. I promise that next week the video will be the tutorial itself, and I can't wait to meet you there, see you there, and have you comment here with any questions or concerns that you may have if you want to make your own crochet yoga tank top. So I will see you in next week's video with the full tutorial. Bye! Oh, happy crafting, don't forget.